David had always loved the quiet of the mountains. At 23, he was studying to become a forest ranger. And this October trip to the Oregon wilderness was supposed to be simple. Just him, his camping gear, and 2 weeks of studying tree growth patterns for his final project. He'd been hiking for 3 days when he heard it. A sound like thunder, but wrong somehow. Too sharp, too sudden. The birds stopped singing all at once, which made his skin crawl. David had spent enough time in the woods to know when something wasn't right. Following the sound deeper into the forest, he pushed through thick bushes and climbed over fallen logs. The smell hit him first, something burning, but not wood, metal. Maybe. Then he saw it through the trees, a chunk of twisted silver metal, about the size of a small car, buried halfway into the ground. Steam was rising from it, and the trees around it looked scorched. David's first thought was that a plane had crashed. He pulled out his radio to call for help, but got nothing but static. He was too deep in the mountains for any signal to reach. That's when he saw her. She was lying about 20 feet from the wreckage, curled up against a large rock. At first glance, she looked like any other person who'd been in an accident. Dark hair, average height, wearing some kind of strange jumpsuit. But as he got closer, David noticed something odd about her skin. It had an orange tint to it, almost like she had a really weird tan. He knelt beside her and checked for breathing. She was alive, but barely. Her pulse was weak, and she felt ice cold. Her face had unusual features too. Her eyes were a bit larger than normal, and her ears came to slight points. But she was clearly human enough, and she was hurt. David didn't waste time wondering about her appearance. His forest training kicked in. He carefully checked her for broken bones, then wrapped her in his spare jacket. She was lighter than he expected as he lifted her into his arms. His research cabin was only half a mile away, but carrying someone through thick forest made it feel like 10 miles. By the time he got her inside, David's arms were shaking with exhaustion. The cabin was basic, just one room with a wood stove, a couple of beds, and some shelves with supplies. David laid her on one of the beds and started a fire to warm the place up. He heated water and cleaned the cuts on her face and hands as gently as he could. She had a fever, so he kept cool cloths on her forehead and made sure she stayed covered with blankets. When she shivered, he added more wood to the fire. When she seemed too hot, he cracked a window. David had learned basic first aid, but this felt like trying to help someone when you don't really know what's wrong. The first night was the worst. She tossed and turned, mumbling words in a language he'd never heard before. Sometimes she'd cry out like she was having nightmares. David stayed awake, changing her cloths and checking on her every hour. By morning, her fever had broken, but she still wasn't conscious. David managed to get some water into her mouth with a spoon, drop by drop. He also tried giving her some of his soup, though most of it just ran down her chin. On the second day, she opened her eyes a few times, but they seemed unfocused. She'd look right at him, but didn't seem to see him. When he spoke to her, she'd make soft sounds back, but nothing that made sense. David started talking to her anyway. He figured if she could hear him, it might help her feel less scared. He told her about his studies, about why he was in the mountains, about his family back home. He described what he was doing as he cared for her, explaining each step like she was a scared child. The strange thing was, even though she looked different, something about her seemed familiar. Not like he met her before, but like she belonged somehow. Maybe it was the way she smiled slightly when he talked, even while unconscious, or how she seemed to relax when he was nearby. On the third day, David noticed her skin was starting to look more normal. The orange tint was fading, and her features seemed a bit less unusual. He wondered if it had been some kind of reaction to whatever accident she'd been in. That evening, while he was heating soup on the small stove, he heard her speak clearly for the first time. "Water," she said, her voice hoarse but perfectly understandable. David spun around. She was sitting up in bed, looking at him with bright, intelligent eyes. No confusion this time. She was completely alert. "Thank you," she said simply. "You saved my life." David handed her a cup of water, his mind racing. How did she know English? Where had she come from? What was that crashed metal thing in the forest? But looking at her now, sitting there with his jacket wrapped around her shoulders, those questions seemed less important than the fact that she was okay. Whatever else was going on, he'd helped someone who needed it. That felt right, no matter how strange the situation was. She drank the water slowly, watching him over the rim of the cup. There was something in her eyes, gratitude, yes, but also a kind of sadness, like someone who'd been lost for a very long time and had finally found their way home. "My name is Elena," she said, "and I have a lot to explain." David never told anyone about Elena. Not his parents, not his college friends, not even his girlfriend Lisa when she asked why he seemed so distracted after his research trip. How could he explain that he'd spent a week caring for someone who claimed to be from another planet? The story sounded crazy even in his own head. Sometimes, late at night, he'd wonder if the whole thing had been some kind of stress-induced hallucination. Maybe he'd hit his head on a branch and imagine the entire encounter. But then he'd remember specific details, the way Elena's eyes seemed to glow slightly in dim light, or how her hand felt strangely warm when she'd touched his forehead before. Disappearing into the forest after graduation, David took a job as a park ranger in Olympic National Park in Washington. The work suited him perfectly. He loved being outdoors, helping visitors, and protecting the wilderness. His colleagues quickly learned that David was the guy you could count on. When someone got lost on the trails, David would search longer than anyone else. When injured animals were found, he'd drive them to wildlife rescue centers on his own time. His supervisor, an older ranger named Bill, once asked him why he went so far out of his way to help others. "Just seems like the right thing to do," David had answered, with a shrug. He couldn't explain that ever since that week in the mountains, helping people felt more important than it used to, like he'd learned something about how connected we all are. David married Lisa 3 years after becoming a ranger. She was a teacher at the local elementary school, and they met at a community barbecue. Lisa loved David's gentle nature and his stories about park adventures. Their wedding was small and simple, held right there in the park under a canopy of Douglas fir trees. They had 2 kids, Tommy first, then little Amy 2 years later. David turned out to be the kind of father who never missed a school play or soccer game. He taught both kids how to identify animal tracks and which berries were safe to eat. On camping trips, he'd point out constellations and tell them stories about the stars. "Dad knows everything about nature," Amy would brag to her friends. David would smile, but never mention that his interest in astronomy had started after meeting someone who traveled between the stars. The years rolled by peacefully. David got promoted to head ranger, and Lisa became the school principal. Tommy grew up to be a mechanic who could fix anything, while Amy became a nurse. Both kids inherited their father's helpful nature. David's reputation in the community grew too. He was the guy who organized search parties for missing hikers. When the big storm of 2018 knocked trees across half the park roads, David worked 18-hour days to clear them. During the pandemic, he helped deliver groceries to elderly folks who couldn't get out. "You're going to work yourself to death," Lisa would tease him, but she was proud of her husband's dedication. The truth was, David couldn't shake the feeling that he was supposed to help people. Ever since Elena, every act of kindness felt like it mattered more than it should. He'd pull someone's car out of a ditch and feel like he'd done something important. He'd bandage a hiker's sprained ankle and think about Elena letting him care for her when she was vulnerable. Sometimes visitors would thank him for going above and beyond. And David would remember Elena's words, "Your kindness will not be forgotten." At the time, he thought she was just being polite. Now he wondered if she meant something deeper. David followed space news more than most people. When NASA discovered new planets, he'd read every article. When scientists talked about the possibility of life on other worlds, he'd pay close attention. Lisa noticed his fascination, but figured it was just curiosity. "Think we'll ever meet aliens?" she asked him once while they were watching a documentary about Mars. "Maybe we already have," David had replied quietly, Lisa laughed. You sound like you're speaking from experience. David just smiled and changed the subject. As 2024 arrived, David was 59 years old and thinking about retirement. His hair had turned gray, and his back ached after long days on the trails. Tommy had given them to grandchildren, and Amy was engaged to a doctor from Seattle. Life felt complete and satisfying. The Park Service was planning a retirement party for David, and the whole community wanted to be there. He touched so many lives over the decades that the guest list kept growing. Local newspaper wanted to do a story about his years of service, 37 years of helping people. The reporter had said during their interview, "What drives someone to be so dedicated?" David had thought about Elena, about that week when he cared for a stranger, without asking questions or expecting anything in return, about how that simple act had somehow shaped everything that came after. "I guess I learned early that helping others is what life's about," he'd said. "We're all just trying to make it through, you know. Sometimes we need someone to lend a hand." He never could have imagined that someone was about to return the favor in the most extraordinary way possible. It was a Tuesday evening in October when David's ordinary life changed forever. He was doing his usual evening patrol, checking the park trails before heading home to Lisa's pot roast dinner. The autumn air was crisp, and the leaves were turning their brilliant reds and golds. After 37 years of walking these same paths, David knew every tree, every rock, every bend in the trail. That's why he noticed immediately when the forest went completely silent. No bird songs, no rustling of small animals in the bushes. Even the wind seemed to stop. David paused on the trail, his ranger instincts telling him something was very wrong. In all his years in the wilderness, he'd only experienced this kind of absolute silence a few times, right before major earthquakes or severe storms. He looked up at the sky, expecting to see storm clouds, but the evening was clear. Stars were just starting to appear as the sun set behind the mountains. Then one of those stars began to move. At first, David thought it might be a satellite or the space station. But this light was getting bigger and brighter, moving in a way that no satellite ever could. It seemed to dance across the sky, making sharp turns and sudden stops that defied everything David knew about physics. The light descended toward the forest, and David's heart started pounding. Memories of that day in 1987 came flooding back. The crashed metal object, Elena's orange-tinted skin, her promise that his kindness would not be forgotten. The light landed in a clearing about 100 yards ahead of him on the trail. David approached slowly, his flashlight shaking in his hand. What he saw took his breath away. It wasn't the twisted wreckage he'd found decades ago. This was something magnificent, a smooth, silver craft that seemed to glow with its own inner light. It was perfectly shaped, like someone had taken a teardrop and stretched it out. No visible engines or windows, yet it somehow looked both powerful and elegant. A section of the craft's side simply melted away, creating an opening. Soft blue light spilled out, and figures began to emerge. David counted 5 beings, all walking with purpose and dignity. They wore flowing robes that seemed to shimmer and move like liquid starlight. But it was the figure in the center that made David's knees go weak. Elena stepped out of the craft, and she was nothing like the injured woman he cared for all those years ago. She moved with the confidence of someone who commanded respect from everyone around her. Her robes were more elaborate than the others, decorated with patterns that seemed to shift and change. As she walked, on her head was something that could only be described as a crown, not made of metal or jewels, but constructed from the same flowing light that surrounded the ship. She hadn't aged a single day. While David had grown old and gray, Elena looked exactly as she had when she disappeared into the forest 37 years ago. Her skin still had that faint orange glow, and her eyes still held that otherworldly intelligence he remembered. The beings with her spread out in a protective formation, but Elena walked directly toward David. With each step, he felt a strange energy in the air, like the moment before lightning strikes. "Hello, David," she said, and her voice carried clearly across the clearing even though she was still 50 feet away. "I told you I would not forget your kindness." David's mouth felt dry. Elena, is it really you? She smiled, but it wasn't the warm, grateful smile he remembered. This smile held power and authority. I am Queen Elena now, ruler of the Stellar Federation of the Outer Worlds. My people call me your majesty. The title hit David like a physical blow. Queen? The woman he fed soup to and covered with blankets was royalty? The woman whose fever he watched over for 3 sleepless nights was the ruler of multiple worlds. You were a queen back then, he asked, his voice barely a whisper. I was heir to the throne. Eleanor replied, moving closer. The mission I was on when you found me was crucial to preventing a civil war. When my rescue beacon failed and I disappeared, my people assumed I was dead. The war seemed inevitable. She gestured to the beings around her. But because you saved me, I was able to return home and unite the warring factions. I brought peace to 17 worlds, David. Billions of lives were spared because of your compassion toward a stranger. David felt overwhelmed. He thought he was just helping someone in need. The idea that his simple act of kindness had affected entire civilizations was almost too much to process. I've come to thank you properly, Elena continued, her voice taking on a formal tone, and to offer you the recognition you deserve. You will be remembered in our histories as the human who changed the course of galactic events. But something in her manner made David uncomfortable. The Elena he'd known had been vulnerable, grateful, almost childlike in her appreciation. This version of her seemed distant, like she was following a script rather than speaking from her heart. Elena, he said quietly, you don't need to thank me. I just did what anyone would do. Her companions exchanged glances, and David caught something that looked almost like surprise on their faces. Elena's expression grew more serious. Not anyone, David. Very few beings in the galaxy would risk themselves for a complete stranger. That is why you must be properly honored. Elena raised her hand, and one of her companions stepped forward carrying what looked like a glowing scroll. The alien being unrolled it carefully, revealing symbols that seemed to dance and shift in the soft light from their ship. According to the ancient laws of my people, Elena began, her voice taking on an official tone. When someone saves a member of the royal bloodline, they must be granted the highest honor our civilization can bestow. David watched nervously as she gestured toward the scroll. The symbols were beautiful, but completely foreign to him. Whatever was written there felt important and binding. Like a contract written in starlight, the blessing of the royal guard, Elena continued. It will extend your life by several centuries and grant you abilities beyond normal human limits. You will become Earth's official guardian in our galactic federation, protecting your world from threats you cannot yet imagine. The offer hung in the air between them. David's mind raced as he tried to process what she was saying. Live for centuries, special abilities, become some kind of superhuman protector. It sounded like something from the comic books his grandson loved to read. That's incredible, David stammered. But I don't understand. Why me? I'm just a park ranger who helps someone in need. Exactly, said one of Elena's companions, speaking for the first time. His voice was deep and resonant. Your actions were pure. You helped without knowing who she was or what you might gain. Such beings are rare in any galaxy. Elena nodded in agreement. However, to receive this blessing, you must formally acknowledge my authority. The ceremony requires you to kneel before me and accept your new role as Earth's protector under my rule. The words hit David like a cold splash of water. Kneel? The idea felt wrong in a way he couldn't immediately explain. He looked at Elena's serious expression, at her elaborate crown and royal robes, at the way her companions waited for his response with obvious expectation. I need to understand something, David said slowly. When I helped you back in 1987, did you expect me to bow to you then? Elena looked confused by the question. Of course not. I was injured and vulnerable. You cared for me as an equal. Right, David said, feeling his way through his thoughts. I helped you because you were hurt, not because you were a queen or because I thought I'd get something out of it. I helped you because you were a person who needed help. Yes, and now you will be rewarded for that kindness. Eleanor replied, but there was something impatient in her voice, The ceremony is just a formality, a way to make your new status official. David looked around at the clearing, at this magnificent ship and these powerful beings, and felt completely out of place. But what if I don't want a reward? The silence that followed was uncomfortable. Elena's companions exchanged glances that David couldn't interpret. Elena herself looked genuinely shocked. Everyone wants to live longer, she said finally. Everyone wants to be special, to have power beyond their normal limits. Why would you refuse such a gift? Because it changes everything, David tried to explain. Back then, I helped you just because it was the right thing to do. If I accept this reward now, it makes it seem like I was expecting something. Like, I only helped you because I thought there might be something in it for me. Elena's expression hardened. You are overthinking this, David. The reward does not diminish the original act, it honors it. But David was remembering that week in the cabin more clearly now. How Elena had smiled when he talked to her. How she'd seemed to relax when he was nearby. How grateful she'd been, not as a queen to a subject, but as one person to another. When you were hurt, David said quietly, you didn't want me to bow to you. You wanted me to treat you like a human being. You wanted kindness, not ceremony. I was not myself then, Elena replied stiffly. I was weak and confused. Now I am who I was meant to be. Are you? David asked. Because the Elena I knew wouldn't have asked me to kneel. She would have understood that real friendship doesn't work that way. The tension in the clearing was thick enough to cut. Elena's companions were clearly uncomfortable with this conversation. Their queen was being questioned by a simple human, and they didn't know how to react. Elena herself was struggling. David could see it in her eyes, a battle between who she used to be and who she had become. The power and responsibility of ruling 17 worlds had changed her, and she was only now realizing how much. The ceremony is necessary, she insisted, but her voice lacked its earlier conviction. It is how these things are done. It is tradition. Whose tradition? David asked gently. Yours or mine, because in my tradition, we don't bow to friends. We shake hands. We hug. We treat each other as equals. He could see Elena wavering, caught between her royal duties and the memory of simpler times. But her companions were watching, waiting for their queen to assert her authority. The weight of galactic politics pressed down on the moment. You will kneel, Elena said finally, her voice cold and final. It is required. David stood in the clearing, looking at Elena and her companions, feeling the weight of their expectation. The glowing scroll still floated nearby, waiting for him to accept its terms. The offer of centuries of life and incredible powers hung in the air like a tempting dream, but something deep inside him rebelled against the whole situation. No, David said quietly. The words seemed to echo in the clearing. Elena's companions stepped back in shock. No one had ever refused their queen's direct command. I'm sorry, Elena, David continued, his voice growing stronger. I can't kneel to you, not because I don't respect you, but because it would ruin what we had. Elena's face flushed with anger. You dare refuse me. Do you understand what you are turning down? Immortality, power, the chance to protect your entire world. I understand perfectly. David replied calmly, and I'm grateful for the offer. But think about why you're really here. He took a step closer to her, ignoring the way her guards tensed. You came back because someone helped you when you needed it most. Someone who didn't care that you looked different or asked what you could do for them in return. Someone who just saw another person in pain and wanted to help. Elena's anger faltered slightly. Yes, but now you want to turn that into something else. David interrupted gently. You want to make it official, formal, part of your royal system. You want me to bow and accept rewards and become part of your government. He shook his head. That's not what happened between us, Elena. What happened was simple human kindness. The moment I kneel to you, it stops being about two people helping each other and becomes about power and politics. One of Elena's companions stepped forward. Your Majesty, perhaps we should simply take what information we need about this planet and leave. This human obviously doesn't understand the honor being offered. But Elena held up a hand to stop him. She was staring at David with an expression he couldn't read. "You would really give up eternal life?" she asked. "You would choose to grow old and die rather than accept my gift?" "I'm already old," David said with a smile, "and I've had a good life. I married a wonderful woman, raised two great kids, helped thousands of people over the years. I don't need to live forever to feel like my life had meaning." He gestured toward the ship. "Besides, what kind of life would it be, spending centuries as Earth's guardian, following your rules, reporting to your government? That's not living, Elena. That's just a very long job." Elena was quiet for a long moment. When she spoke again, her voice was softer. "But if you don't accept the protection, your world could be in danger. There are hostile forces in the galaxy. Then, protect us because you want to," David said, "not because of some formal agreement or ancient law. Protect us because you remember what it felt like when someone protected you." The silence stretched on. Elena's companions were clearly uncomfortable with how long this was taking. Their queen should have simply commanded obedience and moved on. But Elena was thinking. David could see it in her face. She was remembering things she'd forgotten. The way he'd stayed awake all night when her fever was high. How he talked to her gently when she was scared. How he'd never once asked her for anything in return slowly. Elena reached up and removed her elaborate crown. The light from it dimmed and went out. Without it, she looked more like the woman David remembered. "I haven't thought about those days in the cabin for years," she admitted. "Being queen changes you. Everything becomes about duty and tradition and maintaining authority. I've forgotten what it felt like to just be me." She looked at the crown in her hands. "When you cared for me, I wasn't a queen. I was just someone who needed help. And you weren't trying to impress royalty or gain favor. You were just being kind." David nodded. "That's all it ever was, just one person helping another." Elena set the crown down on a nearby rock and walked closer to David. Her companions looked scandalized, but she ignored them. "You're right," she said. "The moment you bow to me, everything changes. We stop being equals who shared something special, and we become ruler and subject." She extended her hand to David, not in a royal gesture expecting him to kiss it, but in the simple way friends greet each other. David shook her hand warmly. "It's good to see you again, Elena. You look exactly the same." She laughed, and for the first time since arriving, it sounded genuine. "You look terrible, old and gray and wrinkled." "Hey now," David protested with a grin. "I'm distinguished." They stood together in the clearing. Just two people talking like old friends. Elena's companions didn't know what to do with this breach of protocol, but they waited quietly. "I want to show you something," Elena said. She gestured, and images appeared in the air above them, cities on distant worlds, peaceful and thriving. "This is what your kindness helped create. 17 worlds living in harmony instead of tearing each other apart in war." David watched in amazement. "It's beautiful. Your world will be protected," Eleanor promised, "not because of any ceremony or formal agreement, but because protecting the home of someone who taught me about real compassion is the right thing to do." She picked up her crown but didn't put it back on. "I should go. My duties are waiting. But David, thank you, not just for saving my life, but for reminding me who I used to be." As Elena and her companions returned to their ship, David felt a sense of peace he hadn't expected. He'd given up immortality and incredible powers, but he kept something more valuable, the simple satisfaction of knowing he'd helped a friend remember herself. The ship lifted silently into the night sky and disappeared among the stars. David walked home to Lisa's pot roast, content in the knowledge that sometimes the greatest service you can provide is simply staying true to who you are.